For more now, let's turn to Rebecca Roiphe and Kirk Burkhalter. Rebecca is a CBS News legal contributor and a professor at New York Law School. Kirk is also a professor at New York Law School and director of the school's 21st Century Policing Project. He is also a retired NYPD detective. Rebecca, let me begin with you. The jury took about 10 hours to reach a verdict. What does that tell you about their deliberations?
Well, first, I want to say what it doesn't tell us. I think it's important to say this. I don't think it has any indication that they weren't taking their charge seriously. I think there's no reason to believe that the jury didn't consider the facts and consider the law well. So there's that. I think it does tell us that they weren't confused about the law. They seem to not have sent out any notes. They weren't expressing concern or asking for any readbacks of any of the transcript. It also tells us that they were in lockstep. They were working well together, if not in total agreement from the very beginning.
You know, Kirk, I want to get your thoughts on just this moment before we sort of delve into the specifics about potential sentence. We see the charges spelled out there. But, you know, from your perspective, this has been such a complex kind of case in which there is a lot of history intersecting with this particular moment. Can you just give us your reflections, first of all, of the impact of this guilty verdict? We heard from the family of George Floyd earlier. We've now heard from the president and the vice president of the United States. What kind of impact do you think this guilty verdict is going to have?
Certainly. So there are so many points here that I could refer to, but one impact that I consistently think of is seeing Chief Arredondo and several members of his department testify for the prosecution. So the impact here is kind of breaks this chain where this is some form of unwritten rule where police do not testify, do not engage in this type of case until after it's over. So that's certainly one impact. The other is the impact that it will have on the passage of the George Floyd Justice Bill. And what's so interesting about that bill is that there are two men that will be tied together in perpetuity. Written into that bill is the reference to the Edward Byrne Fund, which many police departments receive a tremendous amount of funding from. Edward Byrne was a police officer that was murdered in New York in the early 80s. So here we have a police officer that lost his life and a man that lost his life at the hands of the police. However, together, their memory can hopefully do some good. When I think and reflect on this case, I think that it is a beginning, and I hope it does continue to be a beginning. We saw the governor of Minnesota speak quite eloquently, and so did the president and the vice president. And I think that everyone does see this as a beginning and a call to action about the work that needs to be done to repair law enforcement and the social justice issues in this country.
Rebecca, let me turn to you now. Take us through what happens next. What kind of sentence is Chauvin looking at potentially? What is your sense, given what we know about the outlines of this case?
So there were three charges. He was convicted on each of those three charges, and each of those three charges come with different sentences. So the second-degree murder charge comes with a maximum of 40 years. The guidelines range in Minnesota is 12 and a half years. The third-degree murder charge comes with a 25-degree maximum, 25-year maximum, and comes with again a 10 and a half year range. And then the manslaughter charge is a 10-year maximum and more like 4 years for somebody like George Floyd who doesn't have previous convictions. So the question now is, will the court see there as being aggravating factors that require a higher sentence than that sentencing range? And George Floyd waived the right to have the jury determine whether there were those aggravating factors. So now it's the judge's job to do that. So we're waiting for the pre-sentence investigation where a probation officer will go out and look in a holistic way at the defendant, the victim, the nature of the crime, the impact here, and then make certain recommendations and try to help to lead the court to a fair sentence.
And then, Rebecca, what about Chauvin's legal team? What are the options here that they're looking at when it comes to appealing the verdict?
So his defense team has been setting this up, queuing it up from the very beginning. I think the main issue on appeal is going to be the question about undue influence on the jury, whether or not the fact that this case was so ubiquitously covered in such an emotional way, especially in this community, made it almost impossible for him to get a fair shot. And so he repeatedly asked the judge before the trial to move this away from this county into a place where he would have a more, in his words, a more neutral jury. He also tried to have the jury sequestered and failed in that effort. So I think that'll be a big issue on appeal. You also, I don't know if you remember, but the judge at one point scolded Representative Maxine Waters for making some comments about the case during it, saying this is setting up a possible appellate issue. So that will certainly come into play as well.
Yeah, and on that point, Kirk, so that was Monday for people who missed it. The judge was very critical of Congresswoman Maxine Waters and the comments that she made during a protest over the weekend. Let's go ahead and play, for viewers who may have missed it, part of what she said.
We're looking for a guilty verdict. We're looking for a guilty verdict, and we're looking to see if all of the talk that took place and has been taking place after they saw what happened to George Floyd, if nothing does not happen, then we know that we've got to not only stay in the street, but we've got to fight for justice. But I am very hopeful, and I hope that we're going to get a verdict that is say guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away.
So again, that was over the weekend, and the comments from Judge Cahill came on Monday saying that Congresswoman Waters' comments might work in favor of the defense on an appeal. Kirk, can you just talk a little bit about that? What did he mean there?
Sure. So first, the defense made this motion and stated that that she was Congresswoman Waters was inciting violence, and actually, fight and remain in the street and protest and so forth doesn't necessarily mean or cannot mean that she was inciting violence. So that might be a bit of a leap. The judge certainly was annoyed, and I think that when you have a trial like this going on with so much national attention, he was concerned about someone muddying the waters, and that certainly is an issue. That's juxtaposed with the position that this is the United States of America, and there were many people talking about the trial and opining on the trial in the media, elected officials, and so forth. Broadly speaking, the judge did want, and he admonished her, stating that politicians should stay out of politics, and he was concerned about her inserting herself in the jury process. The argument would probably be some form of intimidation or pressure or so forth. I don't know how far this will get. However, certainly the defense, has nothing to lose by making an appeal. But we have to look at those words and see if they really were meant to incite the crowd and to intimidate the jury. That certainly will be the defense's argument.
Rebecca, could this guilty verdict in the Chauvin case have any impact on the trial of the other 3 officers charged in George Floyd's death?
Yes, I think it could. I think it boxes that defense a little bit into a corner. The idea is they are charged with aiding and abetting manslaughter and aiding and abetting murder, and they're somewhat precluded. I mean, not in a legal way, but this makes it such that they're somewhat precluded in arguing that there wasn't actually a murder, that there was no principle involved here. And it pushes them back into an argument where their only way to go is we weren't helping, we weren't aiding and abetting. And the law of aiding and abetting makes that a little bit difficult because you don't have to do all that much. And, from those videos, we did see those officers holding back the crowd, doing certain things that may be seen by a jury as aiding and abetting. But I do think that will be a harder trial anyway to prove, and this may make it such that those officers end up deciding to take a plea rather than going forward.
Kirk, I wonder more broadly, how could this verdict impact other cases of police brutality in the future, you think?
Well, that is certainly the big question here. And as I mentioned, one way it will impact is seeing the chief and other police officers testify. It's hard to say that this would be a watershed moment. One thing to remember is that this case is somewhat of an outlier, given the heinous nature of what we saw on the video that brave young woman took. This is not the type of case that we see quite often. A police officer just blatantly kneeling on the neck of a person for 9.5 minutes. Now, this is not to trivialize in any way all the other incidents that we have been witness to, but this is an outlier in the heinous nature. So the jury is still out on that one, pardon the pun, as to where this will fall. Like, will it change our perception of what happens or what occurs when the police are placed on trial, or will it not? Certainly, it kind of, to some extent, breaks through this invulnerability, the fact that police officers can be charged. It was very rare up until this point that we would see police officers charged and prosecuted for murder. And that's important. The charge was murder. And usually it's kind of manslaughter or some form of negligent homicide, but this was a murder charge, and that's rare. And I do think police departments around the country are going to stand up and take notice.
All right, Rebecca Roiphe and Kirk Burkhalter, thank you both very much for sharing your expertise and insight with us on this day. We really appreciate it.